Most of the knights were effectively estate managers managing their properties around southern Europe. It would have effectively killed the order as a viable military and naval...
And as a business.
Yeah.
So I do wonder if Lepanto actually happens if Malta is captured, because the difficulty of putting together this Holy League, normally sort of fronted by the Pope, between the various Italian city-states, also Spain. If Malta falls, your appetite for getting into this part here to support Venice and Genoa, all these other Western interests, are probably going to reduce.
Tell me if you think I'm daft with this theory, but could you make an argument that maybe the Spanish Armada doesn't get launched? If you have an Ottoman threat in Europe that is greater than it was, and you've got Philip thinking, well, instead of worrying about those pesky Protestants in England, I've got to worry more about the Sunni Islamists in Malta who are coming up maybe through Italy. Is there a scenario there?
If I really wanted to throw the counterfactual sort of, cat amongst the pigeons, I would agree with Chris that if Malta had fallen, even if the Turks hadn't proceeded into Italy proper, it would have required a major recalibration of their relationship with the local powers.
How close did the Great Siege of Malta come to succeeding in your view?
Wafer thin on several occasions.
It's the 18th of May, 1565, and an island in the Mediterranean is about to become a fierce battleground between empires, faiths and ideals. Malta, where the Christian Knight Hospitaller had been headquartered for 35 years. With its location vital for trade routes and greater European control, the Ottoman Empire had the island in its sights. So began one of the period's greatest and most mythologized battles, which saw the heavily outnumbered knights survive a near 4-month-long bombardment from an Ottoman armada that saw tens of thousands of casualties. This was the Great Siege of Malta. I'm James Hanson and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. This episode is sponsored by Visit Malta. Right in the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta is a blend of history, culture, nature and hospitality. To find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. Today we're discussing the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, a monumental bombardment and a successful defensive standoff which became celebrated across Europe at the time. Yet how significant was it, and what might history have looked like had the Ottoman Empire been victorious? These are questions for our experts, and joining me today as ever is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by the historian and author of The Great Siege of Malta, Professor Marcus Bull. Welcome to you both. We have in front of us a map of the Mediterranean really at the time, or the region at the time, and you can see Ottoman expansion over the centuries leading up to the Great Siege, and you can see how much control they have over parts of North Africa, parts of Europe, parts of the Levant as well. Marcus, welcome to History Undone. Great to have you on the channel.
Of course.
Can you set the scene for us as to just how sort of influential the Ottoman Empire is at this point of the 16th century?
By the time of the Great Siege, it's coming towards the later stages of a very active, dynamic period of expansion since the mid-15th century, and it had peaked in the 15 teens with the capture or appropriation of Egypt, Palestine, and this granted access to the Red Sea. This was a complete game changer. Egypt was very rich. The finances of the Ottoman state were transformed. It also made the Ottoman state a global player by granting it access to the Indian Ocean, which was later secured when in the 1530s it also gained access to the headwaters of the Persian Gulf. In many ways, therefore, the Ottoman state is eastward looking. Its principal military rival is Iran. But as far as Western Europeans were concerned, they saw the Ottomans principally in terms of the threat that it posed them. And by the 1560s, the Ottomans are the subject of a kind of collective phobia, an obsession with the Turk in the singular, this imminent, irrepressible threat. The Ottomans began as a land empire, and to a large extent they remained so, and much of their military activity directed against Europe was on this front against the Holy Roman Empire in what is now Hungary and the northern Balkans. But since the 1520s or 30s, they'd also developed or expanded a nascent naval arm, and this had allowed them to also take the fight to the other part of the former Habsburg world, other than the Holy Roman Empire, which was the Kingdom of Spain and its various possessions in Italy. So one is confronted by the 1560s with this binary opposition, a unified Ottoman Empire to the east, increasingly expansive and aggressive, though perhaps beginning to reach the outer limits of its effective radius of action, and a more particulate, sort of composite political world in the Western Mediterranean, dominated by Spain and its Italian satellites, but also with France as a kind of ambivalent third party, often allied with the Ottomans. And the question was, therefore, and this is ultimately what was at stake in the Great Siege, would this weaker, less coordinated Western imperium, the Habsburg Mediterranean, be able to mobilize sufficient resources to at least stall or deter or deflect the aggression of the more powerful neighbor to its east? And that's really the story of the Great Siege in summary.
Chris, always great to have you with us on History Undone. Of course, this is happening under the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and there is also a key religious component here as well.
Yes, absolutely. So as well as the geopolitical division here, you've got a very serious ideological one as well. The Turks are, of course, Sunni Muslim, and of course, Suleiman himself likes to expand both the influence of Islam. He's known as Suleiman the Lawgiver, as well as the Magnificent. He's very interested in poetry, the whole culture associated with Islamic art and things like that. The important thing to remember, though, also, is that the Mediterranean Sea is really unstable. It is absolutely infested with geopolitical rivalries between certain cities like Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Genoa, Venice. These are players as well, city-states in many ways. In North Africa, there's a constant interaction between what's going on in North Africa these two empires. The Habsburg Empire based on Spain, and also, of course, its possessions in the New World, we shouldn't forget. It's got those possessions as well. But also this constant interplay between these major states and empires, hyperpowers, if you like, and these city-states and essentially the corsairs and adventurers and privateers that operate out of them. And the period up until 1565 sees a whole series of battles and engagements between not only the corsairs, but also the proxies in Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, whole along the north coast here, and in Europe between the respective superpowers. So it's a constant struggle. And part of the reason that the knights are put into Malta, but they're also put into Tripoli as well. This is the really interesting thing. When they're given Malta in 1530, they're also given Tripoli. And they're not really keen on that because they're right in the middle of the storm here. But the idea is that they're going to hold the line here because what they've done, just as the Ottomans, after they've captured Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul, they've become a major maritime power who can support their proxies, these corsairs and these sort of city-state rulers. What can happen here is that the knights themselves, who've migrated, having been basically evicted from Rhodes in 1522-23, they've been put in Malta really to stop that gap in the middle of the Mediterranean and to stop this advance. But they turn basically into privateers. They've developed a navy, which they've always operated very successfully in the Eastern Mediterranean, operating out of Rhodes. They translate that. They don't fight on land anymore like they did in the Holy Land. They fight at sea. And they're privateers. They're pirates, basically. And they're combating all the time the other pirates, corsairs and privateers that are operating here. And occasionally you get big figures like the Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria. He fights. One of the admirals involved in this operation, Parry, is involved in a huge battle over the island of Jerba, which was designed to break up the link between Algiers and Tripoli. It's a huge disaster for the Christian element, the Holy League at that time. And generally, the Christians get the worst of it. In the big battles, the Turks are really successful, not only at Jerba, but at Preveza, which is in northwest in 1538. And so it's this constant battle between city-states, these hyperpowers who sponsor them, and essentially huge business interests that run on the edge of legality most of the time.
Marcus, why is Malta of so much strategic significance at this point? If you're the Ottomans, why have you got your eyes on Malta?
Well, I suppose the best way to do that is to think about what it isn't. That it's almost exactly midway east to west across the Mediterranean, and also midway north to south, measured from the top of the Adriatic Sea to the Libyan coast. And one would therefore say, well, of course, it's the centre of the Central Sea. Why wouldn't any aggressive imperial power want to possess it? That centrality was only really apparent in the 19th century with the opening of the Suez Canal and the linking of British interests across the Mediterranean from Gibraltar all the way to the Nile Delta. Malta it's symbolic rather than, if you like, a question of raw strategic interest. I would argue that the Ottomans' principal interest in the islands is not necessarily to hold it, which would have been very expensive and not necessarily strategically viable in the long term, but to destroy the Order of St. John, the Knights Hospitaller, on it once and for all. Suleiman, as a young sultan, had chivalrously allowed them to retreat from Rhodes towards the beginning of his reign. And as Chris was saying, in the intervening 40-some years, they had developed or expanded their role as corsairs, as glorified self-appointed pirates. And there was a sense in which, as he came towards the end of his reign, he would die in 66, that if he had any unfinished business in that part of the world, this was the time to do it. And so I think rather than aim for the conquest of Malta per se, almost as if the conquest of Malta was incidental to the destruction of the pointed end of the order. What the Ottomans would have done with the Malta had they conquered it is open to debate, and perhaps we can talk about that later. But I think the principal thrust of the Ottoman war aims is to neutralize, negate the Order of St. John once and for all. And in the process, I think, and this is something that's the unknown about the Great Siege, and so it takes a little bit of a backstory, but this map is a little bit misleading because from Egypt westwards, the scheme would suggest that this coastal strip is equally part of the Ottoman Imperium as is its core here. But in a way, and as Chris has intimated, this was a much more semi-detached part of the Ottoman world. It was a series of city-states with small hinterlands, each ruled by an uneasy alliance of Ottoman representatives, if you like, pirate kings and local interests. And the Ottomans never integrated this long Maghrabi stretch fully into their power base. And critically, they never built any naval bases further west than the Nile Delta. Had this strip been fully integrated into the Ottoman realm, Malta would have been in serious trouble, because it would have been facing a unified Ottoman shore at its closest distance, only about 200 miles from the area around Tunis. As it was, 1565 campaign begins with the departure of the fleet all the way up here in Istanbul. Why come all this way when in theory they could have come this very short distance? Well, they couldn't because this area could not support the infrastructure or didn't have the wealth, nor did the Ottomans enjoy the political control to be able to use this as a jumping off point for the campaign. So Malta is therefore remote from the operational range of the war fleet. Tunis probably represented about the outer limit. They have to co-opt corsair kinglets, especially in Algiers and in Tripoli, to help them with manpower and certainly with supplies as the siege unfolds. So that's a very long-winded question about why is Malta important. I think it's simply what it represents as the last best refuge of a group which was punching above its weight, which interfered with Ottoman naval interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its lifeline now was the trade routes that joined Alexandria to Istanbul, and the Knights were the principal threat to that lifeline.
Well, just before we get on to the events of the Great Siege itself, a word on the Knights, Chris. Who are they, and why are they of such significance at this point?
So they have their origins back in the 11th and 12th century in the Holy Land. They're the mirror image, if you like, of the Templars, who were suppressed in the early 14th century, but they have an additional role as well. They not only looked after pilgrims in the Holy Land, they also looked after their medical needs. So there's a huge element, and even today, the Knights of St John have a very, very large medical sort of series of jobs that they do. But they're also fighting soldiers as well. And they are committed to, obviously, the Holy Land at that stage. They're essentially the monks of war, as Desmond Stewart called them. They're single. They're Catholic, obviously, because everybody's Catholic at that point. But, of course, as we approach the 16th century, the Reformation happens, and the order particularly becomes associated with the Spanish Empire. Philip II, Charles V initially, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's also King of Spain, and then Philip II takes them very much under his wing in military terms, but they are directly subordinate to the Pope. They have no other allegiance other than the Pope. So they're like a monastic order in that sense. So, as we've said, they were in Rhodes until 1522-3. They wandered around, really, for about 7 years and eventually were given Malta and Tripoli, a bit of a poison chalice with Tripoli hanging onto it. They've got a series of commanderies, essentially sort of stations around Europe, in every country, except Britain, of course, except England after the Reformation. Having said that, de Valette, the Grand Master's secretary, Oliver Starkey, is the only English knight who is actually in Malta at the time of the siege. And they get their revenues essentially from the landed estates that they've been given in the past, or like the Templars had until their dissolution. They also rely, obviously, on other states giving them money, giving them military support. They also hire themselves out. When there's a Holy League or the Spanish want to do something in North Africa, something like that, basically as paid mercenaries in that sense. They help Andrea Doria, who is the leading admiral, to suppress Turkish and other pirate kings, as Marcus very appropriately calls them. But more importantly, they get quite a lot of their money from actually grabbing merchant ships going through. And one of the things that really infuriates Soliman in 1564 is the Chevalier Romagas captures a huge galley that's leaving from, it's a galliot in fact, not a galley, that is leaving from Venice, full of real good things coming from Venice. And most of the ladies of Suleiman's harem have got shares in it. And he carries this huge prize off to Malta, and this really annoys Suleiman. And although Suleiman, of course, is a hard Jew politician, the chief eunuch gets in his ear about this and says, you know, we've lost a lot of money here, you've got to deal with these guys. And it's the final straw. And he says, right, we're going for this. But here's the thing, they're already planning it anyway. And I think Marcus is right. It's this very annoying wasp's nest, what Turgot Rice later calls this nest of vipers that sits here, that's not just annoying the Ottoman Empire, but actually getting in the way of quite a lot of what these people are trying to do. And the Knights, don't forget that they lost Tripoli in 1551. I think one thing worth mentioning is that there are two previous sieges of Malta, one in 1429, where there's been a siege where they basically enslaved the population of Gozo. But Turgot Rice, one of the major players in the Siege of Malta, comes and basically tries to take the islands here, but goes away and is dissuaded from doing it.
Well, there we go. Some really important context there. Let's zoom in now and focus on the events of the Great Siege of Malta itself. OK, before we get into the Great Siege of Malta itself, let's just run through some of the key statistics. The Ottomans brought around 40,000 troops on an armada of around 200 ships to Malta. Among these men included around 9,000 cavalry and 6,000 elite Janissary soldiers. Their casualties were very heavy, losing at least a third of their men. But some Christian estimates claim they lost more than two-thirds. The Knights, meanwhile, had around 9,000 men in total, including Spanish, Italian and local recruits. Yet only 6,100 were trained fighters and between 450 and 500 knights. At least 2,500 soldiers were killed and Malta lost a third of its civilian population. Over 130,000 cannonballs were fired during the siege. OK, well, let's talk about the events of the Great Siege of Malta itself now. First of all, let's do a bit of sort of the geography of the island and the significance of the defences at the time. Chris, do you want to talk us through Malta as an island and I suppose its natural defences as well?
Yeah, as you can see, it's basically a small archipelago, and the main island, Malta itself, is about 18 by 9 miles. You've got another significant island, Gozo, up to the northwest, and two little ones, Comino and Cominotto, in between. In 1565, population of the island was about 25,000, and they were basically concentrated in what we call the two cities of Birgu and Senglia, which are the two little peninsulas that sit on the south side of Grand Harbour, which is that very large harbour on the northeast coast, as you can see. The other significant areas you need to see are up on the northeast coast, where you've got St Paul's Bay, where St Paul traditionally was shipwrecked, and down in the south here, Marsa-Schlock. And that's quite significant in relation to where the Turkish fleet are going to operate. But most of the action takes place around Grand Harbour and its accompanying harbour, Marsamxett. The other significant place that we need to consider is just to the west of the island, just up from where it says Malta there, is the old town of Medina. It's the old capital. It's essentially a medieval walled town. Most of the aristocracy live there. They're sulking because the island's been given to the knights. And the knights themselves are concentrated basically on Grand Harbour, which is where their galleys operate from. And of course, their fortresses have been built. So if we switch to the map here, you're seeing essentially the area around Grand Harbour itself. Fantastic natural harbour, one of the sites, I think, of the world and the Mediterranean. And in 1565, it's centred, as I said, on Senglia, which is this town here, and Birgu. And on the end of Birgu, you've got Fort St Angelo, which is a very large fortress, which has large numbers of cannon on it that can dominate not only the harbour itself, but also the peninsula of Skibaras opposite. Now, after they lost Tripoli in 1551, they said, right, we really got to fortify Malta now because they may come for us next. And so significantly, St Angelo gets another tier added to it, and they build this star-shaped fort here, which is called Fort St Elmo. And it's designed, obviously, to dominate the entrance. But unfortunately, Grand Harbour is overlooked by two heights. One's Calcara here, the other is Corradino. But significantly, St Angelo's cannons can reach across the harbour here. The accompanying harbour here, Marsamxett, is a fantastic deep water harbour with Manol Island in the middle, and it can take the whole of the Turkish fleet if you want it to. But initially, the Turks arrive on the 18th of May. They go around the islands. They take their whole fleet of 200 past Grand Harbour entrance so the knights can see what they're up against. They circumnavigate. They go to the northwest of the island and they land their troops there. But what happens is there's a dispute between the general, Mustafa, and an admiral called Parry. And for the Turks, he's the sort of David Beckham at sea of his time. He's a young guy, he's only 40. He got fantastic reviews after the Battle of Jerba, which he fought with a pirate king called Turgut Reis. And he's really worried about two winds that affect Malta, the Scirocco and the Grigali, which comes significantly from the northeast. And he doesn't want to risk his fleet. So he says, look, I really need access to this harbour here. And Mustafa says, no, I don't want to do that. I want to capture Medina. I want to cut Malta off from Sicily because that's where any relief is going to come from. But Parry gets his way. And he says, I'll put my fleet in Marsa-Schlock down in the southeast, but I want to go into Marsamxett. Otherwise, I can't get you home. He literally says that, I cannot take you home if my ships are wrecked. And Parry, because of his great reputation, because of the way he is, gets his way. And Suleiman had said to Mustafa, you treat Parry like a favoured son. And this is on his mind. And we can take up the story of what happens and why St Elmo then becomes very important.
Well, Marcus, do you want to pick up the story and talk about the siege of Fort St Elmo?
Well, let me begin with this map, because this map originates in an image painted for the Pope in the Vatican. And it itself drew on what had become, in the 10 or 15 years after the Great Siege, the standard way of representing the story of the siege, because it's a conspectus, both of the area in which most of the fighting took place and of particular events during it happening simultaneously.
So it's a cartoon, really.
It's a cartoon.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the one way in which this image, the painter of this image, departed from his models was that he paid much more attention to populating Marsham Shed and the area immediately outside Grand Harbour with ships, with galleys, as if emphasising more than his exemplars how this was an amphibious operation, which turned on the interaction between, as Chris has been saying, the interaction or collaboration between the Ottoman fleet and its land forces. That amphibious nature placed particular focus on St Elmo because it controlled access to Marsham Shed, the more secure and more proximate harbour than Marsa-Shlock, where they first berthed. So the first Ottoman assault is directed towards St Elmo. It takes about 5 weeks. It's a subject of debate. Were the Turks foolish to devote so much time, energy and manpower and to lose a large percentage of their elite forces thrown against St Elmo when they could have been directing their energies against the principal defences across Grand Harbour? But the needs of an amphibious force were paramount, and therefore the fleet had to be securely placed in Marsham Shed. In the event, against all expectations on both sides, St Elmo's hangs on for about a month, and in the event, that month that it bought allowed the defenders in the two principal areas, Birgu, St Angelo and Senglia, St Michael, to improve their scarcely adequate but just about okay defences. That allowed the heroic defence and ultimate loss of St Elmo, with almost everybody there, defenders killed, to be cast as a kind of Thermopylae of self-sacrifice, the few that bought the time for the many. It's often argued that the Turks, if Turgut Reis had sort of arrived earlier, he would have deterred them, the leaders, from this foolish course of action. I'm not entirely persuaded about that. There is documentary evidence coming out of Istanbul as early as late 1564, which might suggest that they knew that St Elmo was going to be their first target. What they didn't know was that it would take so long.
I mean, the key thing is the Turks never really sealed St Elmo off till the end. So you were able to reinforce across the harbour at night with fresh supplies of troops, ammunition and supplies. And right till the very end, just before the 23rd of June is when it was, the Grand Master, Jean de Valette, is saying we must supply St Elmo as long as possible. But in the end, they even conduct a counterattack where the Turks have to bring the Janissaries in. Now, these are the shock troops of the Ottoman Empire. These are essentially ex-Christians who've become guardsmen, if you like, and they're used to actually drive back the knights behind their fortifications. And
Turgut Reis himself is killed at St Elmo.
Well, Turgut makes the very valid point that they're attacking down the front door here through Mount Shibaraz, but they're actually not got batteries here on Gallows Point or Teeny Point here. And he's supervising essentially what's going on. Remember, he's 80 years old, this guy. So he's been the scourge, the drawn sword of Islam for quite some considerable time in the Mediterranean. And again, Suleiman said to both Mustafa and Parry, you pay attention to what Turgut Reis says, because he knows what he's talking about. And remember, Parry has operated with Turgut at the Battle of Djerba, so they know each other quite well. But he's setting up a battery on Teeny Point here to basically try and surround and invest St Elmo. And the real fall of St Elmo occurs simply because the island's made of soft sandstone, so is the stone of the fort. Of course it is, because that's where it's quarried from. And the sheer firepower that the Turks are able to bring in terms of cannonballs, and we've said how many got fired, just completely crumbles most of these these fortifications to dust. There's a critical point when a ravelin, an exterior sort of fortification, is captured by the Turks, and from then on, St Elmo is captured. But as Marcus says, it's bought them time, and all the while now, La Valette, the Grand Master, is sending messages out to Sicily, to Don Garcia de Toledo, saying, look, I need help here, and your king is going to want you to help me, isn't he? And he's pushing very hard. And Don Garcia de Toledo says, I can't intervene until I've got a force strong enough, until I've got some really good intelligence. And one of the key things that the Turks failed to do throughout this is seal off Malta from the outside world. So Mustafa was right originally. We need to capture Medina, cut off the rest of the island and all the communication to Sicily. They never achieve it. And it's quite important on a number of occasions.
And Marcus, so they've captured Fort St Elmo. Where do the Turks turn their attentions next?
OK, so they've used about a third of their artillery, a very large artillery train, actually, one of the largest in the European theatre until perhaps the 18th century. They bring that train to join the principal one down the Shibboleth Peninsula, bring it around and position it in a huge arc from these heights off the map and then back to this. So there's a sort of almost a 180-degree semicircle. If you are in modern Valletta and looking from the Upper Baracca Gardens, which is about here, you very quickly get a sense of how these two peninsulas are dominated by high ground all the way through that arc.
And meanwhile, Parry has got his ships in here.
Yes, and meanwhile, this with St Elmo neutralised, this allows the Turkish fleet to essentially be proximate to, be close to the land forces, which is absolutely vital in amphibious warfare. So the next stage of the campaign, really with variance between late June and early September, is the theme of bombardment of these two peninsulas, the defensive lines here, which aren't contiguous. The creek, what is now called Dockyard Creek, breaks into them. So there were two frontages which the defenders were responsible for. To some extent, that weakened them. And how would they be able to get troops from one to the other if they needed reinforcements? They improvised a pontoon bridge, which is depicted here. But I think in the long run, it actually helped them because it forced the Turks sometimes to concentrate their attacks either on one or the other. Sanglia was much weaker, but its land frontage was much narrower, which allowed the relatively weak forces there to be able to resist assaults, whereas most of the Christian defenders were placed in the longer, more heavily fortified frontage.
And you've got Fort St Michael here as well, haven't you, which is a tiny fort that actually sticks in the way.
So how close did the Ottomans actually come to capturing Birgu and Sanglia?
So there's a number of attacks. They try an amphibious landing, for example, on Sanglia. They put together about sort of 1,000 janissaries. They put them in about 100 boats. And what they failed to notice was a low-level battery that had been built here that totally demolishes that attack. So that didn't work. But I think the biggest attack, it's a whole series of attacks take place. There's an initial attack, but mainly a cannonade. But I think the most significant one, and I'm sure Marcus would agree, where probably Birgu in particular probably would have fallen, is on the 7th of August when there's a massive attack. And there are breaches in the walls and everything like that. And suddenly all the Turks are seen to be streaming away. And what has happened is some of the cavalry that John de la Valette has stationed in Medina have gone on a raid on the Turkish camp, and they've destroyed all the places where the wounded are, and they've destroyed stores and this, that, and the other. And the Turks think it's a relief force arriving. So just at the point when it was probably going to fall, they stream away. And all the while, you had this communication between Medina. And I should say that 6 days after St Elmo fall, a force of 700 Spanish troops arrived in the west of the island. They made their way around the Turks and came to reinforce Sanglia and Birgu. So they never sealed it off, and they were able to get in. But this attack, which was only a raid, frankly, from Medina to see what they could get out of raiding the Turkish camp in the Marsa, totally calls off that main attack. And then you have a whole series of desultory attacks. And you have cannonade going on all the time. And towards the end of August, Marcus, Piali's saying, you know what, we need to get home. The weather's going to get pretty sticky in September. I've been charged with this fleet. I'm the Sultan's grandson. and I know what it means if we lose the fleet. And by the way, we can't live off the land if you're staying here.
But how difficult a decision would that have been? Because presumably that would have been hugely humiliating. They've invested a lot of time, energy and effort to do this. And, having captured St Elmo, to then suddenly decide, what, we're going home again. How difficult a decision was that?
Well, the Ottoman record is largely of success. They weren't particularly practiced at failure. But I think it's much like the sort of doctrine of a fleet in being, which also applied to the Habsburgs. The priority was to preserve the fleet come what may, and take whatever losses, quit while you're ahead. And I think, don't forget also that the dates, this was before the Gregorian reform of the dates, which in fact meant that early September is what we understand by middle of September. And October was regarded as the absolute outer limit of safe navigation on the Mediterranean. So they were cutting it very fine. And so I think there's evidence that already the Ottomans were disengaging. They were beginning to load up their fleet before a large relief force arrived from Sicily in early September. We know that when the fleet sort of arrived back in Istanbul with its tail between its legs, there was a great gnashing and wailing. There was public outcry. European ambassadors reported that it was unsafe for Western Christians to go out into the street. But what the Ottomans did, getting ahead of ourselves slightly, was to do what they always did with reverses, which was to absolutely throw resources at recovering and to achieve the status quo ante. And by 1566, their fleet was actually larger than it had been in 1565. So they were able to take the knocks.
And Marcus, how close did the Great Siege of Malta come to succeeding in your view?
Wafer thin on several occasions. One example of that is on the 7th, and again a fortnight later, when the main thrust of the attack was against the Birgu frontage. Villette, with a sort of squad of reinforcements, would gather in the piazza, ready to go to where they were needed. And twice, even though by this stage Villette is an old man, he's quite infirm, he charges into the fray to lead any counterattack when the line is beginning to break, when the killing zone is beginning to dissolve. And after the fact, this is interpreted, it's spun as evidence of his great fortitude and heroism. I'm convinced that on both occasions he was convinced that the game was up and that his priority was not to be taken alive, which is what the Ottomans had said was their ambition, to kill everybody apart from Villette and to take him back and humiliate him in Istanbul. So I think Villette's actions, subsequently misinterpreted as great bravery, are evidence that he knew that these margins were wafer.
I think there's also, Villette, rightly gets a lot of credit for sort of handling the strategy of this. At one stage in August, they say, look, let's go back into St Angelo. Let's abandon Birgu. We just can't deal with it. Well, you can see on the map here that massively exposes Sanglier from the flank here. The bridge of boats becomes inoperable. The boom probably as well here becomes inoperable. And he says, no, we're not. We're going to fight and stand here. And if we don't hold these lines here, we're done for. And he's absolutely right, because these are natural fortresses. It's extraordinary when you go to Malta to look at them. And you see Grand Harbour itself. It is quite extraordinary. And if you're dominating Grand Harbour with your cannon and you're able to hold these positions, we always say if you're assaulting somewhere, you need at least a margin of 3-1. Well, that was getting pretty marginal too, Marcus, because by the end, the knights and their forces have lost about 5,000 people. There are probably about only 600 fighting men left, some of whom are injured. So that's how close it comes in manpower terms by this stage. But holding the lines here is absolutely critical, and that's Villette's decision. There's no question about that, just as holding out in St Elmo was. And looking at it, it's quite extraordinary. He gets every tactical and operational decision right. It is quite extraordinary. Even the information warfare, if you like, when St Elmo fell, the Turks actually put decapitated knights' bodies on crosses and floated them across. Well, Villette's answer to that was to execute his Turkish prisoners and fire their heads across from the cannons. And the Turks, as you might expect, were a bit dismayed by that.
As you would be,
But we've got to remember, you've got a certain amount of fanaticism on both sides here. These are committed Christian warriors. and committed sort of Islamists as well. And particularly, they had about 3,000 what you would call dervishes on their side, these guys who would get high on drugs and attack you.
And one last thing to mention, Marcus, the relief force does indeed arrive.
Yes, just as the Turks are already disengaging, but they clash in the interior of the island. There's a running battle which forces the Turkish army towards St. Paul's Bay. There's a final massacre as they scramble into the boats and they sail off on the 12th of September. But in a way, the Great Relief, as it became known, just performs the coup de grace. I think the Turks were already committed to leaving the island, but the Christians were able to spin the idea that the Great Relief had been responsible for their defeat.
Well, there we go. That is the real history of what happened during the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some really big long-term questions. Had the Great Siege played out differently, what might the long-term consequences have been? Marcus, to start with you, I mean, what does it mean for Ottoman expansion? Do they end up expanding further into Europe?
Well, there are two theatres. They revert to focusing their efforts in the short term on the land campaign against the Austrian Habsburgs in the Danube Valley. They're still not done with the central Mediterranean. 9 years after the Great Siege, they recaptured Tunis, which had briefly fallen to Christian hands. And this was their last great acquisition in that part of the world. Thereafter, they and the Spanish Habsburgs agree to tie. They've been sucked into an arms race. The Spanish are building a larger fleet. Neither side wants the expense of maintaining and enlarging those fleets. So they agreed to a kind of working truce. So Malta doesn't put an end to Ottoman aggression, though it does represent an important punctuation mark. The image we looked at before derived from the map in the Vatican. If you go to the Vatican gallery of maps and look at the original of that image, on one side of a door, on the other side of the door is a matching image, which is a depiction of the Battle of Lepanto, which is to suggest, 6 years later, in 1571, which is to suggest that very early, this image was made about 1580, people understood that the story of the Siege of Malta could only really be comprehended if it was placed in conversation with the Battle of Lepanto, the great Christian victory over the Ottoman war fleet off the coast of Greece 6 years later. We can debate whether Lepanto itself was very consequential. It was perhaps more important on a psychological level than it was ultimately on a strategic level. But I think the significance of Malta, therefore, was read as a kind of holding operation, which bought time, gave the Christians a degree of confidence that the Ottomans weren't invincible, and even persuaded them to go on the offensive, which they did 6 years later with a Holy League involving the Spanish, Venice, and the hospital as well. So to that extent, the Great Siege was not decisive, but it's interesting in what it made possible in following years.
Chris, do you agree?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there's an issue to do with North Africa as well. I think if the Turks take Malta, there was talk before the siege of them actually then springing on to Sicily and Italy. They did talk about it.
And you think that could have happened?
Well, it was in their documents. And bear in mind that for most of the century up to that point, the Turks and their allies here have been raiding the coasts of Spain, Italy. They captured Corsica at one stage on behalf of the French. And all these islands were subject to constant raiding and sort of trading alternately. So my sense is if they captured Malta, I think the Sultan and his successors would have said, look, we're going to assert more control over North Africa now. These guys, they've worked for us, but they really are sort of semi-independent. We don't like that.
Yeah.
And I think, oddly enough, I think the effect would have been felt in North Africa rather than in Italy and Sicily. I mean, on the north side, the Spanish are quite strong. There's no question about that. They want to hang on to, obviously, Rome with the Vatican and all their possessions here. What it does do, though, you see, it completely seals off the South Channel here, if you take Malta. And if you think that the Knights were a pain operating out of there, then, if you get the likes of Turgot and the successors of Turgot operating out of there, it's actually quite a bit of a problem for Sicily as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Knights. What happens to the Order of St. John, Marcus, in the scenario in which Malta falls?
Well, I think, though by the end, only about between a third and a quarter of the complement of the order was actually on Malta. And most of the knights were effectively estate managers managing their properties around southern Europe. It would have effectively killed the order as a viable military and naval...
And as a business.
It would have had no point. There was talk of them relocating to Corsica, to some of the islands, Ile d'Hier, which are off the south coast of France. But they wouldn't have been able to operate anything like as much as before.
King of Sweden offered them Gotland in the Baltic. And they said, no, thanks.
They would have just dissolved. They would have had no raison d'etre. Recruitment would have dried up, and they would have just become a relic.
I mean, what's interesting is, they decay into the Baroque period. Their whole raison d'etre disappears as obviously Western military and naval power pushes in this direction. And by 1798, Napoleon arrives and says, well, actually, I'd like to use Malta as a naval base, if you don't mind, because I'm on my way to Egypt. And I think the Grand Master says, well, you can put 2 ships in Grand Harbour. And he said, well, that's not good enough. So he puts his army there and says, I'm coming here anyway. And of course, after Napoleon is defeated in 1814, part of the Treaty of Paris, it then becomes a British crown colony. And the knights are then dispersed, as Marcus says. There's a late bid by the Tsar of Russia to take over as Grand Master of the organisation, but it then becomes very much if you like, a social cachet to be a Knight of Malta, as it is today. And it's now transmogrified into a human rights organisation and medical organisation. It employs nearly 50,000 medical staff today. Quite extraordinary that it's kept its origins as a hospitaller order, even though obviously they call themselves knights. In fact, there's about 6 orders of knights. I can't remember.
It's a very complicated ranking system.
Really difficult to understand.
Yes, but they do very good work.
Yeah.
They much like the British offshoot, the Venerable Order, they have hospitals in the Middle East and in Africa which specialise particularly in ophthalmic conditions. That's become their thing.
And what's really interesting, of course, the Maltese cross traditionally is a hospitaller cross, which has now been displaced by the George Cross, which Malta won in World War II. Was
awarded in World War II, absolutely. We did a whole episode on Malta's role in the Second World War. Go back and watch it if you haven't already.
I think just coming on from what Marcus says, I do wonder if Lepanto actually happens if Malta is captured, because the difficulty of putting together this Holy League, normally sort of fronted by the Pope, between the various Italian city-states, also Spain. If Malta falls, your appetite for getting into this part here to support Venice and Genoa and all these other Western interests are probably going to reduce. And your confidence levels, as Marcus says, is pretty low. You're used to losing in the Mediterranean against the Turks. This is like facing the Germans in the World Cup every time. You don't win that often. And so Lepanto, to my mind, there's no confidence in actually investing in that. What we have to remember very much is this is galley warfare. So it's oars predominantly with sails. And the freeboard of these ships is really low, something we perhaps should have mentioned earlier. Anything between 6 and 8 feet. Now, that's nothing in any sort of sea. And so you've got to be really careful. So I don't know about you, Marcus, I don't think Lepanto happens if Malta falls.
I would agree. I think that without the confidence boost and the sense of momentum that Malta imparts, they wouldn't have, I think, taken the fight so deep into Greek waters.
And I think Venice and the Italian city-states actually withdraw even quicker from the Eastern Mediterranean after that point, I would think.
Yeah.
And there's obviously the military significance of the Great Siege if Malta falls. What does that mean for Ottoman expansion potentially? But also economically, I mean, their control over trade routes in the region would be a huge boon to the Ottomans.
I think more in the way the real action is happening here with the trade coming up through the Red Sea and to some extent the Persian Gulf. I think the Ottomans treat the central Mediterranean as a kind of outward defence zone, a buffer or an insulating layer which allows them to treat the Eastern Mediterranean as an internal lake and to increasingly orient their economy towards exploiting the trade coming up from the Indian Ocean. What you'll find in the 15 or 20 years after the Great Siege is that Northern European, Dutch and English ships muscle their way through to increasingly try and dominate the carrying trade back to markets in Europe, cutting out the Venetians. So increasingly one finds heavily armed and aggressive English and Dutch merchants.
High freeboard as well.
High freeboard as well, able to sometimes take the galleys on and sort of worst them, beginning to dominate the outward, the carrying trade beyond, so it bypasses Malta to some extent and follows round into the northern seas. So in a sense, Malta is there as a kind of bulwark, as a kind of zone, a protective zone.
I think there's another aspect as well. If you look at the way the Ottoman Empire operated, it relied very much on expansion and raiding. Having an active frontier enabled people to obviously employ their military potential, but also to reward followers. So I suspect if Malta had fallen, you'd have seen a lot more raiding into the Western Mediterranean and raids on the coast and things like that, because you need that. If you're an expanding empire, if you've got an active frontier, then you can reward, you can employ, and so forth.
On that, and tell me if you think I'm daft with this theory, but could you make an argument that maybe the Spanish Armada doesn't get launched if you have an Ottoman threat in Europe that is greater than it was, and you've got Philip thinking, well, instead of worrying about those pesky Protestants in England, I've got to worry more about the Sunni Islamists in Malta who are coming up maybe through Italy. Is there a scenario there?
Well, we have to understand that by the time of the Armada, Spain has also absorbed Portugal, which also has a very large navy. Quite a lot of the ships that take part in the Armada are Atlantic-based ships. They're galleons and galleasses. There are some galleys that actually turn up. They don't do that well, as you might expect. And also, they take some of the ships from Italy as well. So there is an element of saying that that may be the case. Now, the other interesting thing is that they get quite a lot of their naval supplies from, oddly enough, the Ottoman Empire. So you're not getting it from the Baltic like the Northern Europeans do. I would say that by that time, Philip has enough resources to do both, to tell you the truth. Even if you're getting serious raiding here. They're slightly different maritime forces. You're employing privateers, mercenaries. You're using galleys predominantly here. What do you think, Mark?
I slightly disagree. I think that the truce that they reach with the Ottomans, excuse me, in the 1570s, allows Philip to redirect more of his resources to what really matters to him, which is the revolt of the Dutch against in the Netherlands, one of the key parts of his dominions. And that's ultimately the rivalry between Spain and England is a byproduct of that Dutch revolt. So to that extent, you're right. If I really wanted a further counterfactual sort of, cat amongst the pigeons, I would agree with Chris that if Malta had fallen, even if the Turks hadn't proceeded into Italy proper, it would have required a major recalibration of their relationship with the local powers in northwestern Africa, and that raises the big question, which is always one of those great unknowns of world history. Question: why didn't the Ottomans chase the Spanish across the Atlantic? It wouldn't have. They would have been perfectly capable ultimately of creating naval bases. Well, they didn't need to because the big money was in the Indian Ocean. But I think it would have been interesting to see, had Northwest Africa become more securely an Ottoman territory, fully integrated into the power structures of the rest of the empire, to what extent that would have pivoted the Ottomans westward, and whether that would have involved an Atlantic element. I'm getting very, very
of course, but there is a.
But you're right. Yeah. If you follow the money, there's no money in it at this stage. That's the point. But what is interesting, if you draw it forward to the 20th century, this is where Hitler wanted bases if he was going to take on America. So Marcus's point is really well made. I mean, the question I would have, Marcus, is where would they have got their ocean-going expertise from? Maybe because it's all galley warfare, isn't it, really?
Yeah, but I think they had enough. They were very, very highly skilled, highly adaptable. They also run high-side ships in the Indian Ocean. And they also have a lot of European captives operating as expertise in there.
I mean, I think one thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is there's quite a lot of slavery going on here. Slave holding, Jean de Valette was captured and actually worked as a galley slave. I think Turgot did at one stage.
Yeah,
as well.
it was
so they're
endemic.
capturing each other, and putting each other. I think he was galley slave in Andrea Dora's galley at one stage. So slavery is pretty endemic in the Mediterranean. In fact, Gozo, whenever Malta was attacked before the Great Siege, would always get its population lifted, as recently as 1551 by Turgot race.
Well, listen, gents, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. But I think what we can say is that the Great Siege of Malta did actually come very, very close to succeeding for the Ottomans. And had that happened, well, who knows what the long-term consequences might have been. Does Lepanto happen in 1571? Maybe not. Do you get the formation of the new Holy League? What happens in terms of Ottoman expansion in the region? Do they press on into Sicily and maybe Italy? Do they consolidate in North Africa? And if that happens, as we've just been discussing, do you end up having the Ottomans chasing the Spanish into the Atlantic? Some really big long-term consequences, all stemming from one siege back in 1565. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Marcus Bull for joining me. And of course, thank you to our sponsors, Visit Malta. Remember, if you want to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. You can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.